Tonight's story takes you back to 1954 to a small general store on Main Street in a quiet American town. You'll follow one ordinary shopkeeper, Walter, through one ordinary week. Monday's deliveries, Wednesday's egg trading, Friday's payday, Saturday's slow afternoon. Nothing exciting happens. No conflict, no surprises, just the calm, repeating rhythm of small-town life. You don't need to remember any of it. Just get comfortable, let your eyes rest, and let the story carry you quietly off to sleep somewhere along the way. Walter Hargrove woke, as he did most mornings, before his alarm clock had the chance to ring, at a few minutes past 5:30, in the small bedroom above the store he had run on Main Street in Millbrook Falls for the better part of 11 years now. The house had once belonged to his father, who had run the store before him, and his father's father before that, though the store itself had changed hands and names a few times in its long life on that corner before the Hargrove family took it over for good. The room was cool, the kind of early autumn cool that comes before the sun has had a chance to do much about it, and Walter dressed by the gray light coming through the thin curtains, a collared shirt and a plain blue-gray check, dark trousers held up with suspenders rather than a belt, since he'd found suspenders more comfortable for a day spent bending, reaching, and climbing the small step stool behind the counter. He laced up a pair of sturdy brown work shoes, the leather softened and creased from years of standing on the wood plank floor downstairs. Downstairs, the store was dim and quiet, the way it always was before opening. The shapes of the shelves and counters familiar to him even in the low light. So familiar he could have walked the whole floor with his eyes closed and never bumped a single display. He lit the small stove in the back room to warm the coffee pot he kept there, a plain tin percolator that had belonged to his mother, and while it began its slow, rhythmic bubbling, he went to unlock the front door and flipped the sign in the window from closed to open, even though it would likely be a good 20 minutes before his first customer wandered in. He swept the wooden porch out front first, a short-handled broom kept just inside the door for that purpose, working the dust and the fallen leaves that had gathered overnight into a small pile near the edge of the steps, then out into the gutter where the morning breeze would carry them off toward the storm drain at the corner. The street was quiet at this hour, just the milk truck making its rounds 2 blocks down, and Ed Tolliver from the barber shop next door sweeping his own stretch of sidewalk in the same unhurried way Walter was sweeping his. "Morning, Walter," Ed called over, not stopping his own broom. "Morning, Ed," Walter answered, and that was the whole of it. The same exchange they'd had most weekday mornings for as long as either of them could remember, comfortable in its sameness. Back inside, Walter went about arranging the front window display, which he changed every week or so, depending on what new stock had come in and what the season called for. This week he was featuring a stack of canning jars, since it was the tail end of harvest season and a fair number of the town's women would be putting up preserves before the weather turned properly cold. He arranged a dozen empty jars in a pyramid, a box of rubber sealing rings beside them, and a hand-lettered sign he'd made the evening before that simply read mason jars, fresh shipment, since he'd found over the years that a plain, factual sign worked better than anything fancier. He unlocked the cash register, a heavy black machine with round brass keys that had come with the store when his father bought it and had never once needed replacing, just the occasional cleaning and oiling of its inner workings, which Walter did himself every few months with a small can of light oil he kept in the back room for exactly that purpose. He counted out the till, the same starting float every morning, $3 in coins and small bills, enough to make change for the first several customers before he'd need to break a larger bill. By the time he'd finished, the coffee in the back room had finished percolating, and he poured himself a cup into a plain white mug, added a small amount of milk from a bottle chilling in the icebox, and carried it back out to the front counter, where he set it down within easy reach and took his place behind the register, ready for whatever the day would bring, which, on most Mondays, was not very much at all. At 7:15, the delivery truck from the regional wholesaler pulled up outside, a dark green panel truck with the company's name painted in white letters along the side, driven by a heavy-set man named Carl who had been making this same route for as long as Walter had owned the store. Carl backed the truck up carefully to the side door, the one that opened directly into the stockroom, and the two of them began unloading the week's shipment together, a routine so familiar between them that they rarely needed to speak more than a few words to coordinate it. The crates came off the truck one at a time. Wooden boxes of canned vegetables, string beans, and corn and tomatoes, each can with a simple paper label. A barrel of flour, heavier than it looked, requiring both men to walk it carefully down the small ramp Carl kept folded under the truck bed for exactly this purpose. Sacks of sugar and cornmeal, smaller boxes of dry goods like matches, candles, and boxes of baking soda. A crate of glass bottles containing various tonics and extracts that Walter kept on a shelf near the front counter, since customers tended to ask for them by name rather than browse for them. Walter checked each item against the invoice Carl handed him, a carbon copy sheet listing quantities and prices, using a stub of pencil he kept tucked behind his ear for most of the morning. He found, as he usually did, one small discrepancy. The invoice listed 6 cases of canned peaches, but only 5 had come off the truck, and Carl apologized, made a note on his own copy, and promised the 6th case would come on next week's delivery along with a small credit applied to Walter's account to make up for the shortage. This was not the first time this particular kind of small mistake had happened, nor would it be the last, and neither man thought much of it. Once the truck had pulled away, Walter spent the better part of an hour moving the new stock from the stockroom out onto the shelves, a task he did methodically, working section by section. First restocking the canned goods aisle, checking that the older cans were pulled to the front and the new ones placed behind them, a habit he'd learned from his father and had never had reason to abandon. Then the flour and sugar, decanted where needed into the large wooden bins near the back that customers could scoop from directly, paying by weight rather than by the prepackaged pound. He worked the scale often during this part of the morning, a large brass balance scale mounted on the counter near the bins, its 2 flat pans hanging from delicate chains, a set of small iron weights kept in a wooden box beside it. He didn't need the weights for his own restocking. He'd learned to eyeball a 5-pound scoop of flour closely enough over the years, but he checked the scale's balance regardless, out of the same habitual carefulness that governed most of what he did in the store. By the time the shelves were restocked and the empty crates broken down and stacked by the back door for Carl to collect on his next trip through, it was nearly 9 o'clock, and Walter allowed himself a short break, sitting on an overturned crate near the stockroom door with the last of his now-cooled coffee, looking out through the small back window at the alley behind the store, where a gray tabby cat that belonged to no one in particular was stretched out in a thin patch of morning sun. The bell above the front door rang just after 9, and Mrs. Eleanor Purnell came in, a woman in her 60s who lived 2 streets over and came by most Mondays for her weekly shopping. A list folded in the pocket of her cardigan that she consulted from time to time, even though Walter suspected she knew it by heart, having bought largely the same things for as long as he'd known her. "Morning, Walter," she said, setting her handbag on the counter while she looked over the shelves. "Morning, Mrs. Purnell. Cool one today. It is that. I expect we'll have frost by the weekend." She said this the way she said most things, with a mild, unhurried certainty, and began working her way down her list. A pound of coffee, a small sack of sugar, a dozen eggs from the crate Walter kept near the front counter, sourced from a farm just outside town, a bar of laundry soap, and 2 spools of thread, one white and one navy, from the small sewing notions case near the window. Walter weighed the coffee beans on the brass scale, scooping them from the large burlap sack into a paper bag, adjusting the small iron weights until the pans balanced evenly, then twisting the top of the bag closed with a practiced motion before setting it on the counter. He wrote each item and its price in a small ledger book rather than ringing them all through the register at once, since Mrs. Purnell, like a good number of Walter's regular customers, kept a running account that she settled at the end of each month rather than paying in cash for every visit. They talked, in the unhurried way people talk when there's no reason to rush, about her daughter who was expecting her first child sometime in the spring, about the weather, about a minor dispute 2 doors down between the Hendricksons and their neighbor over a fence line that had been rumbling on for weeks without any real resolution in sight. Walter listened more than he spoke, as was his way, offering a nod or a short comment here and there, tallying her purchases in the ledger as they talked. By the time she left, another customer had come in, young Tommy Averill, sent by his mother with 50 cents and a short list scrawled in a child's careful handwriting, asking for a can of baking powder and, if there was anything left over, a piece of penny candy from the glass jar near the register. Walter fetched the baking powder from the shelf, made change from the 50 cents, and let the boy pick 2 pieces of candy from the jar, a peppermint stick and a small piece of horehound, for the leftover pennies, a small kindness that cost Walter very little and that he extended to most of the children who came through with their mother's errands. The morning continued in this manner, customers coming and going in a slow, steady trickle rather than any kind of rush. A farmer's wife buying canning supplies, an older man picking up a spool of fencing wire and a box of nails, a young woman new to town asking where she might find a particular brand of hair tonic that Walter, after checking his shelves, had to apologize for not carrying, though he offered to add it to his next order from the wholesaler if she'd care to come back the following week. Around noon, the store fell into its usual midday lull, most of the town's residents occupied with their own lunches rather than shopping, and Walter used the quiet time to catch up on smaller tasks that didn't fit easily into the busier parts of the morning. He took the large wheel of cheddar cheese from beneath its glass dome on the counter and cut a fresh wedge for the display, using a long, thin wire strung between 2 wooden handles rather than a knife, drawing it smoothly through the cheese in a single clean motion, the way his father had taught him decades before. He restocked the small bins of loose crackers and cookies near the front, refilling them from the tins in the stockroom, and wiped down the glass display case that held sliced meats and cheeses, though there wasn't much to wipe away, just the usual light dust that settled on glass surfaces over the course of a morning. He ate his own lunch standing behind the counter, as he did most days, a simple sandwich his wife had packed for him that morning, sliced ham between 2 pieces of bread, a little mustard, wrapped in wax paper, and kept in a small tin box in the back room to keep it fresh. He ate slowly, keeping half an eye on the front door in case a customer came in, though for the better part of 20 minutes, none did, and he was left alone with his sandwich and the quiet tick of the large clock mounted on the wall behind the register. He spent some of that quiet time going over his ledger book, adding up the running totals on a handful of accounts, checking his own math twice on each one, since he'd learned early in his years running the store that a mistake in the ledger, however small, had a way of causing more trouble later than the few extra minutes it took to check the figures carefully now. The radio on the shelf behind the counter, a small brown Bakelite set that he kept on low volume through most of the day, was playing a midday program, a mix of local news and a few songs, the announcer's voice warm and familiar, the kind of voice Walter had been hearing on that same station for years without ever once meeting the man behind it. The news covered a modest local matter, the town council's ongoing discussion about extending the paved section of Route 9 another 2 miles out toward the county line, a project that had been discussed, according to the announcer, at 3 separate meetings now without any final decision, and a brief mention of the high school's upcoming football game against a neighboring town's team that weekend. By 12:30, the early afternoon customers had begun trickling back in, a housewife needing a last-minute item for her supper, 2 teenage boys pooling their coins for a shared bottle of soda from the small red cooler near the door, an elderly man who came in most days around this time simply to sit for a while on the bench near the window and talk with whoever happened to be at the counter, more for the company than for any particular purchase, though he usually bought a newspaper or a pack of tobacco before he left. The afternoon passed in much the same unhurried rhythm as the morning had, customers arriving in a slow, steady trickle, small transactions recorded in the ledger or rung through the register, shelves tidied and restocked where needed, brief conversations exchanged about the weather, about neighbors, about nothing of any particular consequence. By 5 o'clock, as the light outside began to take on the deeper gold of late afternoon, the traffic through the store had slowed to almost nothing, most of the town's residents home or heading home for their own suppers. Walter used the quiet final hour to do his closing tasks, starting with sweeping the floor, working the short-handled broom and long, even strokes down each aisle, gathering the day's accumulated dust and the occasional dropped receipt or bit of string into a small pile near the front door, which he swept out onto the porch and then off into the street with one final push. He straightened the shelves where customers had left things slightly askew over the course of the day, a can turned the wrong way, a stack of folded cloth nudged out of its neat pile, small adjustments that took no more than a few minutes altogether, but that he found satisfying to do regardless, restoring the store to the same orderly state it had been in that morning. At 6, he flipped the sign in the window from open to closed and locked the front door, though he left the small bell above it in place, since he'd need to unlock it again in the morning. He counted the till, subtracting the $3 starting float to arrive at the day's total takings, which he recorded in the back of his ledger book alongside the running tally of credit accounts he'd added to throughout the day. It had been an ordinary Monday, neither especially busy nor especially slow, the kind of day that added up, over the course of a week, to a modest but reliable living. He banked the day's cash in a small metal box that he kept in a locked drawer beneath the register overnight, to be deposited at the bank across the street the following morning along with the previous week's takings, and turned off the lights section by section as he made his way toward the back stairs that led up to the small apartment above the store, the same stairs he'd climbed every evening for 11 years. Upstairs, his wife, Ruth, had supper waiting, a simple meal of roast chicken, potatoes, and green beans from their own small garden plot behind the building, and they ate together at their kitchen table, talking over the small events of their respective days, the light outside fading slowly to a deep blue-gray as evening settled over Main Street below. Tuesday mornings, Walter had long ago decided, were the best time for taking stock of the storeroom properly, since the weekly delivery had come the day before and the shelves were freshly stocked, giving him a clear sense of exactly what he had on hand before the week's selling wore the numbers down again. He rose at his usual hour, went through his usual morning routine, dressing, lighting the stove, percolating the coffee, sweeping the porch, exchanging his usual brief greeting with Ed Tolliver next door, and then, rather than opening straight away, spent the first half hour after unlocking the door working through the storeroom with a small notebook and pencil. He counted cans, sacks, and boxes methodically, aisle by aisle, section by section, checking his running totals against the numbers he'd recorded the week before, noting where stock was running low and would need to be specially ordered before the next regular delivery, and where, conversely, certain items had moved more slowly than expected and might need to be marked down or featured more prominently in the window display to encourage sales before they sat too long on the shelf. He noted that the canning jars from the window display had sold well over the weekend, down to just 4 dozen from the 6 dozen he'd started the week with, which pleased him, since it confirmed his instinct about the display had been the right one. He noted that a shipment of new gardening trowels, ordered back in the spring on a hunch that hadn't quite panned out, still had 11 unsold sitting in the stockroom, a small reminder that not every ordering decision worked out as hoped, though 11 trowels wasn't enough of a loss to trouble him much. He checked the icebox in the back, where he kept the store's small stock of butter, milk, and the sliced meats for the display case, noting that the ice delivery, due later that morning, would need to be a full block rather than the half block he sometimes ordered, since the weather, while cooling, hadn't yet turned cold enough to slow the icebox's need for replenishment. By the time he'd finished his count, the store's regular Tuesday customers had begun to arrive, fewer than Monday's crowd. As was typical, Tuesday being a quieter day in the week's rhythm for reasons Walter had never quite worked out, but had simply come to expect over the years, a lull between the start-of-week restocking trips and the later midweek and weekend rushes. Around 10 o'clock, Walter prepared a small delivery for Mrs. Agnes Callahan, an elderly widow who lived alone in a small house on the edge of town and who, given her difficulty walking any real distance since a fall the previous winter, had arranged with Walter some months back to have her weekly groceries delivered rather than making the trip into town herself. She would telephone in her order on Monday evenings, and Walter would have it ready and delivered by Tuesday late morning, a small accommodation that cost him little more than 20 minutes of his time and that he was glad to provide. He packed her order into a wooden crate, a small sack of flour, a tin of coffee, a dozen eggs carefully nestled in straw to keep them from cracking, 2 cans of soup, a loaf of bread from the bakery 2 doors down that he picked up specially for her, since she preferred it fresh rather than the pre-packaged loaves he kept on his own shelves, and a small twist of hard candy that he added without being asked, since he knew she liked to have something sweet on hand when her grandchildren visited. On weekends, he carried the crate the 6 blocks to her house himself, since the store didn't have a delivery vehicle of its own and the distance wasn't far enough to trouble with borrowing one. Walking at an easy pace along Main Street and then down the quieter residential streets that led toward the edge of town, past houses he knew by their occupants' names as much as by their addresses, past yards where the last of the summer flowers were beginning to fade and the maple trees were deepening into their autumn colors, Mrs. Callahan met him at her door, a small, thin woman with white hair pinned neatly back, leaning slightly on a cane, but otherwise steady enough on her feet within the confines of her own home. She invited him in for a few minutes, as she usually did, offering him a cup of tea that he politely declined given the morning's remaining tasks. Though he did sit for 5 minutes at her kitchen table while she counted out the coins for her order from a small tin she kept for exactly that purpose, and they talked briefly about her grandchildren, about the frost she expected any day now, about a radio program she'd enjoyed the previous evening. He walked back to the store at the same unhurried pace, the empty crate under his arm. The morning still cool, but the sun beginning to warm the air pleasantly as it climbed higher, the kind of late September morning that felt, in its own quiet way, entirely satisfactory. Back at the store, Walter turned his attention to the small section near the rear that he'd set aside for feed and garden supplies, a corner that did steady if modest business with the farmers and small plot gardeners who made up a good portion of the town's population. He restocked the burlap sacks of chicken feed, arranging them in a neat stack against the wall, and checked the seed packets in their small wooden rack, sorting out a handful whose corners had gotten slightly bent or torn during shipping and setting them aside to sell at a small discount rather than display them alongside the pristine ones. A farmer named Ross Kettering came in around midday, a broad-shouldered man in overalls who farmed a plot just north of town, needing a 50-pound sack of feed for his laying hens and a coil of fencing wire to repair a section of his chicken coop that had come loose in a recent windstorm. Walter helped him carry the feed sack out to his truck, the two of them working together to heave it up onto the truck bed, and they stood for a few minutes afterward in the cooling midday air, talking about the coming harvest, about a new tractor Ross was considering but hadn't yet decided on, about the price of feed corn, which had crept up slightly over the past month. A small but noticeable change that both men discussed with the mild concern of people who understood such fluctuations were simply part of the rhythm of the year rather than anything to be alarmed about. Ross paid in cash rather than adding to his account, counting out the bills carefully from a worn leather wallet, and thanked Walter for his help loading the feed before climbing into his truck and pulling away, leaving a faint smell of diesel and dust hanging in the air for a moment before it dissipated. The afternoon continued with a handful of similar small transactions, a woman buying seed packets for a fall planting of turnips and winter greens, a young boy sent to buy a length of rope for reasons his mother hadn't specified, an older farmer picking up a new hand scythe to replace one that had finally worn past the point of being resharpened. Because Millbrook Falls was small enough not to warrant its own dedicated post office building in that particular corner of town, the general store had, for as long as anyone could remember, served as an informal mail drop-off and pickup point for the handful of streets nearest Main, a small wooden set of pigeonhole slots mounted on the wall behind the counter, each one labeled with a family name in Walter's own neat handwriting. The mail carrier, a wiry older man named Frank Dubois who had walked essentially the same route for over 20 years, came through most days around 2 in the afternoon, sorting the letters and small parcels for this section of town directly into Walter's pigeonhole slots rather than making individual stops at every house, a small efficiency that Walter had never minded providing, since it brought a steady trickle of foot traffic through the store as people came by to check whether anything had arrived for them. Walter spent a few minutes after Frank's visit double-checking the sorting, since Frank, while reliable, was getting on in years and occasionally slipped a letter into the wrong slot. A small B for Bennett confused with a B for Burroughs, an easy enough mistake to catch and correct given how well Walter knew most of the families involved. Through the afternoon, a number of townspeople stopped by specifically to check their mail. A young woman anxiously checking for a letter from a fiancé stationed with the army out west, who left disappointed when nothing had come, but who Walter reassured, gently, that the mail from that far away could take its time even when nothing was wrong. An older gentleman collecting a small parcel that turned out to be a mail order part for his radio set, which he unwrapped right there at the counter, eager enough that he couldn't wait until he got home. A mother collecting a letter from her son who'd recently moved to the city for work, which she read standing at the counter with a small, private smile before folding it carefully back into its envelope and tucking it into her handbag. The evening closing routine followed much the same pattern as Monday's had, sweeping, straightening shelves, counting the till, recording the day's takings in the ledger, banking the cash in the small locked box for tomorrow's deposit. Tuesday's total was, as expected, a bit lower than Monday's, though not by much. The day's steady if unspectacular trickle of customers adding up to a respectable enough sum by the time Walter tallied the final figure. Upstairs, after supper, a simple stew Ruth had kept warming on the stove through the afternoon, thick with potatoes and carrots and a bit of beef. The two of them sat in the small front room that overlooked Main Street, Walter in his usual armchair with the day's newspaper, which he'd brought up from the store rather than reading during business hours, and Ruth with a piece of mending in her lap, a shirt of Walter's that had worn thin at one elbow. The radio played softly in the corner, a variety program that neither of them followed too closely, more background than anything actively listened to, and they talked, from time to time, about small things. A letter Ruth had gotten that day from her sister in the next county over, a repair Walter was thinking about making to the store's back steps before the weather turned. The football game coming up that weekend that half the town would likely turn out for. By 9:30, the newspaper read through and the mending set aside for the evening. They made their way to bed, the sound of a car passing occasionally on the street below the only real interruption to the quiet. The same quiet that had settled over Millbrook Falls most every evening for as long as either of them could remember. Wednesdays in Millbrook Falls had, over the years, developed into something of an informal trading morning, when a number of the farmers from just outside town would come by the store not to buy, but to sell, or more often, to trade, the surplus from their own small operations, eggs and butter, and occasionally a basket of late-season vegetables, in exchange for store credit or goods they couldn't easily produce themselves. Walter had a small scale set aside near the back counter specifically for this purpose, separate from the one he used for weighing out flour and sugar for customers, and he spent a good portion of Wednesday mornings weighing baskets of eggs and blocks of butter, checking the eggs for cracks by candling them briefly against a small lamp kept for exactly that purpose, and negotiating, in the mild, unhurried way that passed for negotiation in Millbrook Falls, a fair credit for each farmer's goods, based on the current market rate, which he kept track of loosely by comparing notes with the wholesaler's price sheets and with what he'd paid the previous week. A farmer's wife named Dorothy Hensley brought in 3 dozen eggs and 2 pounds of butter that morning, and Walter weighed and candled the eggs carefully, finding only one with a hairline crack that he set aside separately, offering her a slightly reduced credit for that one while giving full credit for the rest. They settled on a total, which he recorded against her family's account, and she used a portion of that same credit right there to purchase a length of gingham fabric for a new dress and a spool of matching thread, a transaction that essentially settled itself without any cash changing hands at all, the eggs and butter effectively becoming the fabric and thread through the quiet accounting Walter kept in his ledger book. This kind of trade made up a meaningful portion of Wednesday's business, farmer after farmer coming through over the course of the morning with their own small offerings, a basket of late tomatoes, a few pounds of honey from a farmer who kept hives on the side, a sack of freshly dug potatoes, each one weighed, evaluated, and credited in turn. The ledger book filling with a steady stream of small entries that Walter would need to reconcile carefully at week's end. By mid-morning, the back counter where Walter conducted this trading business had accumulated a modest collection of goods, baskets of eggs stacked carefully so as not to crush the ones beneath, blocks of butter wrapped in wax paper, and set in a cool corner away from the window's direct sun, a small crate of tomatoes that would need to go into the front display before they softened too much to sell. He worked through this accumulated stock steadily over the course of the late morning, repackaging the eggs into smaller cartons for retail sale, cutting the larger blocks of butter into more manageable quarter-pound portions wrapped individually in fresh wax paper, and arranging the tomatoes into an attractive pyramid in the front window, a task he approached with the same careful attention he gave to any of the store's displays, even for something as simple and short-lived as a crate of late seasoned tomatoes. A conversation with one of the farmers, a taciturn older man named Silas Braddock who came in only rarely and always with the fewest words possible, took a bit longer than usual, a small disagreement over the going rate for a sack of dried beans that Walter felt was priced slightly high given the current market. Though after a few minutes of quiet, unhurried back and forth, the two men settled on a figure that satisfied them both, a compromise reached not through any real argument, but through the kind of patient, wordless negotiation that had governed trade in Millbrook Falls for generations. By noon, the back counter had been cleared, its goods sorted, repackaged, and either credited to accounts or placed out for sale, and Walter allowed himself his usual short lunch break, eating another simple sandwich standing near the front window, watching the midday traffic on Main Street, which on a Wednesday consisted mostly of a handful of trucks and the occasional pedestrian making their own unhurried way from one errand to the next. Twice a week, Wednesdays and Saturdays, the afternoon freight train brought in larger shipments that didn't fit conveniently into Carl's regular delivery truck route, mostly bulkier items like coils of fencing wire, crates of glassware, or seasonal stock like the Christmas ornaments that would start arriving in a few weeks' time to be stored in the back until the appropriate season for selling them arrived. Walter walked the 4 blocks to the small train depot at the edge of town a little before 2, timing his arrival to match the scheduled arrival of the 2:15 freight, a walk he'd made often enough that he barely needed to think about the route anymore. Past the barber shop, the small diner where a handful of regulars were finishing late lunches, past the bank where he'd make his morning deposits, and down toward the depot itself, a modest brick building with a wooden platform running. Alongside the tracks, the station agent, a younger man named Roy Fenwick who'd taken over the position from his father a few years back, was already out on the platform checking the manifest against the day's expected freight when Walter arrived, and the two exchanged their usual greeting before settling in to wait the 10 or so minutes until the train's whistle became audible in the distance, a low, familiar sound that seemed to roll across the whole town whenever the freight came through. The train itself took only a few minutes to unload the crates meant for Hargrove's General Store, a process Walter and Roy handled together, checking each item off against the manifest as it came off the freight car. 3 crates in total this week. One of glassware, carefully packed in straw, one of fencing wire coils, and one smaller crate that turned out to be an early shipment of the Christmas ornaments Walter had ordered back in the summer, a detail that made him smile faintly, since it always struck him as slightly strange to be handling tinsel and glass baubles under the still warm September sun. He arranged for Roy's young nephew, who helped out around the depot in exchange for a bit of pocket money, to bring the crates over to the store on a small handcart later that afternoon, a service Walter paid for with a few coins and, more often than not, a piece of candy from the jar near the register, which the boy always seemed more pleased about than the coins themselves. The crates arrived at the store by handcart a little after 3, and Walter spent a portion of the remaining afternoon carefully unpacking the box of Christmas ornaments, even though it would be a good 6 or 7 weeks before he'd think about setting up any kind of holiday display. He preferred to unpack seasonal stock early, checking each item for breakage during shipping and organizing it properly in the stockroom, rather than leaving a crate sitting unopened and risking a nasty surprise of shattered glass discovered too late to reorder replacements before the season arrived. He worked through the straw packing carefully, lifting out delicate glass ornaments one at a time. Simple round baubles in red, silver, and gold, a few shaped like small birds with delicate painted detail, a string of large glass icicles meant to hang from a mantelpiece or a shop window rather than a tree, checking each one against the light for cracks before setting it carefully into a padded box he kept specifically for storing such fragile stock through the intervening months. Out of the 4 dozen ornaments in the shipment, he found only 2 that had cracked in transit, a small enough loss that he simply set them aside to note in his next order rather than troubling himself over it. He wrote a brief note in his ledger about the shipment's condition and its intended display date, tucking the note into the padded box itself so that whichever version of himself opened it again in late October would have a clear record of exactly what was there and in what condition. The wire and glassware crates he unpacked more quickly, since neither required the same careful handling, sorting the fencing wire coils onto their designated shelf near the feed corner and adding the new glassware, simple drinking tumblers, and a few serving bowls to the houseware section near the front of the store, where they'd sell steadily over the coming weeks to families restocking their kitchens or preparing gifts for a wedding or a new household. The last hour of the day passed quietly, a few final customers trickling in as the afternoon light began its slow slide toward evening. A young couple looking at the new glassware for their upcoming wedding, a boy sent for a spool of kite string, an older woman picking up a length of the gingham fabric that had proven popular enough that Walter made a note to order more on his next wholesale trip. Walter closed up in his usual manner, sweeping, straightening, counting the till, recording the day's total, which included not just the cash transactions but the various trades and credits accumulated through the morning's market business. A slightly more involved bit of bookkeeping than most evenings required, but one he worked through patiently, checking his figures twice as he always did. He banked the day's cash in the locked box, turned off the lights section by section, and climbed the back stairs to the apartment above, where Ruth had a simple supper of fried fish and boiled potatoes waiting, purchased that morning from a fishmonger who came through town once a week with his catch packed in ice. They ate together, talking over the small events of the day, Walter mentioning the early Christmas ornaments with a small laugh at the strangeness of it, Ruth sharing news from a neighbor about an upcoming church social, and afterward sat together in the front room as they usually did, the radio playing softly, the evening settling in around them in the same unhurried, familiar way it always did on a Wednesday in Millbrook Falls. Thursday mornings, Walter had long ago set aside as the day for the store's deeper cleaning tasks, the kind of work that didn't fit easily into the daily routine of sweeping and straightening, but that needed doing every week or two regardless. Washing the front windows, both inside and out, polishing the brass fittings on the cash register and the scale, and giving the wood plank floor a proper scrubbing rather than just a sweep. He filled a bucket with warm water and a small amount of vinegar, his preferred solution for streak-free glass, and worked through the front windows methodically, starting with the inside, wiping in broad, even strokes with a clean rag, then stepping outside to do the same to the exterior, standing back every so often to check his work against the morning light, which had a way of showing every remaining streak or smudge that a duller light might have hidden. The brass fittings, the ornate curls and flourishes decorating the cash register's casing, the small hooks and chains of the balance scale. He polished with a separate soft cloth and a tin of brass polish he kept for exactly this purpose, working the polish into the metal in small circular motions until it began to gleam, a task that took the better part of 20 minutes given the register's considerable ornamentation, but one that left the whole front counter looking, by the time he'd finished, considerably brighter than it had that morning. The floor scrubbing he saved for last, moving the smaller display tables and crates out of the way section by section, working a stiff bristled brush across the wood planks with a bucket of soapy water, rinsing and wringing the mop frequently, and leaving each section to dry before moving the displays back into place. It was, by any measure, the most physically demanding of his weekly tasks, and by the time he'd finished the whole floor, a process that took the better part of an hour, his shirt had dampened slightly at the collar and his shoulders carried the mild, satisfying ache of honest work done properly. By the time school let out at 3:30, Walter had long since finished his cleaning and settled back into the day's more usual rhythm of customers and small transactions, and the store saw its predictable Thursday surge of children stopping by on their way home, pooling their allowances for penny candy from the large glass jars arranged along the front counter, peppermint sticks, horehound drops, small chocolate discs wrapped in colored foil, licorice whips that Walter kept in a separate jar since they had a tendency, if stored too close to the chocolate, to pick up an odd flavor from proximity. He knew most of these children by name, having watched a good number of them grow from toddlers trailing behind their mother's skirts into school children capable of counting out their own pennies and making their own small decisions about how best to spend them. He was patient with their deliberations, which could stretch out for several minutes as a child weighed the relative merits of 2 peppermint sticks against 1 chocolate disc and a licorice whip, and he never rushed them, even when a small queue formed behind the counter, understanding that this particular kind of unhurried decision-making was, in its own small way, an important part of a childhood spent in a town like Millbrook Falls. A girl named Susan Fairweather, no older than 8, spent a full 5 minutes debating between a peppermint stick and a small paper packet of chocolate drops before finally settling on the chocolate, counting out her 3 pennies with careful concentration and thanking Walter with the particular seriousness that children sometimes bring to small transactions they consider quite important, even if the adults around them might not. By 4:30, the after-school rush had tapered off, the children dispersed back to their homes with their small treasures, and the store settled back into its more typical afternoon quiet, broken only by the occasional adult customer stopping in for a last-minute item before supper. With the afternoon quieting down, Walter turned his attention to a task he tried to complete every Thursday. A thorough review of the store's credit accounts, checking each family's running balance against what they'd purchased over the preceding weeks, making sure his own bookkeeping matched what he remembered of their visits, and flagging any accounts that had grown larger than he felt comfortable extending without a word to the family in question. A conversation he always tried to have, gently and without any real judgment, understanding that most families in Millbrook Falls were doing their honest best with what they had, and that a temporarily large account balance was rarely a sign of anything more than a difficult month. He worked through the ledger book page by page, a task that required careful concentration, checking figures against figures, correcting the occasional small arithmetic error he found in his own earlier entries, and making a short list of 2 or 3 families he intended to speak with quietly over the coming days about settling their accounts. Nothing urgent, just the kind of routine housekeeping that kept the whole system running smoothly. He noted, with some satisfaction, that most accounts were in reasonably good order, families settling their balances at or near the end of each month as was customary, the credit system functioning largely as it was meant to, a quiet mutual trust between Walter and his customers that had, over 11 years, rarely been seriously tested. The work took the better part of an hour, Walter seated on his stool behind the counter with the heavy ledger book open before him, a cup of coffee cooling forgotten at his elbow, the afternoon light slanting lower through the freshly cleaned front windows and casting long, warm shadows across the wood plank floor he'd scrubbed clean that same morning. Toward the end of the afternoon, Walter finally got around to a small repair he'd been meaning to make for the better part of 2 weeks. The screen door at the back of the store, the one leading out to the alley, had developed a persistent squeak in its hinge and had begun sagging slightly on its frame, catching on the door sill each time it was opened or closed. He fetched his toolbox from the stockroom, a battered metal box that had, like the cash register, come down to him from his father, and set to work removing the door from its frame, unscrewing the 2 hinges carefully and setting the small screws in a shallow dish so as not to lose them. He cleaned the hinge pins with a rag dampened in a bit of the same light oil he used on the register, working out the accumulated grit that had caused the squeak in the first place, and applied a fresh drop of oil to each pin before reassembling the hinges. The sagging proved a bit more involved, requiring him to plane down a small section of the door's bottom edge where it had begun catching on the sill, a task he performed carefully with a hand plane, checking his progress frequently by rehanging the door and testing its swing before removing it again to shave off another thin curl of wood. After 3 such adjustments, the door swung freely and silently, closing with a soft, satisfying click rather than its previous squeak and catch, a small fix that gave Walter the same quiet, disproportionate satisfaction that small, well-executed repairs always seemed to give him. He returned his tools to the toolbox and the toolbox to its shelf in the stockroom, and tested the door once more for good measure, swinging it open and shut a final time, listening for any remaining trace of the squeak, finding none. The evening closing followed its usual pattern, and Walter found himself, once the till was counted and the day's figures recorded, feeling the particular satisfaction that came from a Thursday well spent, the windows cleaned, the brass polished, the floor scrubbed, the ledger reviewed and squared away, the screen door finally fixed. None of it amounted to anything anyone besides himself would likely notice, but the noticing had never really been the point. Upstairs, supper was simple, leftover fish from the previous evening, reheated, with a bit of fresh bread and butter, and afterward, Walter and Ruth sat together in the front room, the radio tuned to a program Ruth particularly enjoyed, a light comedy hour that drew the occasional soft laugh from her as she worked on her mending, while Walter read through the day's newspaper. An article about the upcoming harvest festival the town held every October catching his attention, a modest annual event that Millbrook Falls had held for as long as anyone could remember, with a small parade, a pie contest, and games for the children on the town green. They talked, briefly, about whether they'd enter anything in the pie contest this year, a friendly debate they seemed to have every autumn without ever quite committing either way, and by 9:30, the newspaper set aside, and the radio program concluded, they made their way to bed. Another ordinary Thursday folded quietly into the town's long, unremarkable history. Friday mornings carried a slightly different energy than the rest of the week, not exactly busier in themselves, but carrying the anticipation of the weekend ahead. when the store would see its heaviest traffic of the week as families did their larger weekend shopping and farmers came into town for Saturday's market activity. Walter used the morning to prepare accordingly, restocking shelves more heavily than usual in anticipation of the coming rush, checking his supply of paper bags and wrapping twine, and making sure the register's coin float was larger than his usual weekday amount, anticipating the greater volume of transactions Saturday would bring. He spent a portion of the morning in the stockroom, taking a careful inventory of what remained from the week's delivery and comparing it against what he expected to need through the weekend, making a short list of items he'd need to specially request from Carl on the following Monday's delivery if the weekend sold through his current stock as heavily as he anticipated it might, particularly canning jars, which had been moving briskly all week, and coffee, which seemed to be running low faster than usual, though he couldn't immediately account for why. He also spent some time on the front window display, changing it out from the canning jars, which had largely served their purpose for the season, to a display better suited to the coming harvest festival. A small arrangement of pumpkins purchased from a local farmer, alongside a few bolts of autumn-colored fabric and a hand-lettered sign announcing the festival's date. Still a few weeks off, but close enough to begin building a bit of anticipation among the townspeople who passed by his window. Each day, Friday was payday for a good number of Millbrook Falls working men, particularly those employed at the small lumber mill on the edge of town and the handful who worked for the county road crew, and Walter's store saw a steady stream of customers throughout the afternoon settling their accounts, cashing checks, and doing their own version of the same weekly restocking Walter himself had done that morning, buying tobacco, a bit of hard candy for their children, and whatever household staples their wives had asked them to bring home. Walter kept a reasonable amount of cash on hand specifically for check cashing on Fridays, a service he provided as much out of neighborly convenience as for any profit in it, charging no fee for the service beyond what a customer might spend while they were in the store anyway. He verified each check carefully against the issuing company's known signature, a habit born of one unfortunate incident some years back involving a forged check that had cost him a modest sum and taught him the value of careful verification, though nothing of the sort had happened since. A mill worker named Hank Doyle came in mid-afternoon, cashing his weekly check and using a portion of it to settle the account his family had built up over the preceding weeks, counting out the bills carefully and thanking Walter with the particular warmth of a man glad to have his obligations squared away before the weekend. He bought, with what remained, a new pocket knife for his son's upcoming birthday, deliberating over the selection in the small glass case near the register for a good 5 minutes before settling on one with a simple bone handle, practical rather than showy, which seemed, Walter thought, entirely in keeping with the kind of gift a working man like Hank would choose for his son. In the quieter stretch of the afternoon between the lunch hour and the after-school rush, Walter turned his attention to the small hardware section along the store's side wall, a section that had grown somewhat disorganized over the preceding weeks as customers browsed through bins of nails, screws, and small fittings without always returning items to their proper place. He spent the better part of an hour sorting through the bins, separating nails by size back into their labeled compartments, untangling a small mess of picture-hanging wire that had gotten knotted together, and straightening the display of hand tools mounted on a pegboard along the wall. Hammers, screwdrivers, a small selection of saws, each hung on its designated hook, outlined in chalk on the pegboard itself so that both Walter and his customers could easily see at a glance what belonged, wherein notice quickly if something had gone missing or hadn't been returned to its proper spot. He took the opportunity, while working through this section, to note which hardware items were running low and would need reordering, adding a few lines to the growing list he was compiling for Monday's delivery. A fresh box of assorted wood screws, another coil of picture wire, a restocking of the smaller carpenter's nails that seemed to move faster than any other size, likely due to the number of small household repairs that called for them. A customer, a local carpenter named Joe Restino who did odd building jobs around town, came in partway through Walter's reorganizing and picked through the freshly sorted nail bins with evident appreciation, remarking that it was easier to find what he needed when everything was properly separated, a small compliment that Walter accepted with a modest nod, pleased in the quiet way a person is pleased when a bit of unglamorous, unnoticed work is, for once, actually noticed. Walter closed the store a little later than usual on Friday evening, The payday traffic keeping a small trickle of customers coming through even past his usual 6 o'clock closing time. And it was closer to 6:30 by the time he finally flipped the sign to closed, swept the floor, counted the till, and made his way upstairs, tired in the particular way that came from a long but ordinary day of steady, unremarkable work. Ruth had supper ready, a bit more substantial than the weekday meals, a small pot roast she'd been tending since early afternoon, with carrots and onions cooked down soft alongside it. And they ate together at their usual table, the kitchen warm from the oven's lingering heat, talking over the events of their respective weeks now that Friday had brought them both to its close. After supper, rather than settling into the front room as they usually did, they took a short walk together down Main Street in the cooling evening air, past the darkened shop windows, past the diner where a handful of the town's younger residents were gathered for a Friday evening milkshake, past the small movie theater where a modest queue had formed for the evening's showing, a Western that had been playing to decent crowds all week according to the marquee. They didn't go in themselves, content instead with their walk and the mild pleasure of simply being out in the cool evening air together, the town settling into its Friday evening rhythm around them, porch lights coming on one by one along the residential streets as they made their way back toward the store and the stairs leading up to their own quiet apartment above it. Before bed, Walter spent a final quiet half hour at the small desk in the corner of their bedroom, going over his notes from the day and finalizing the list he'd need to give Carl on Monday morning. The canning jars, the coffee, the hardware items, a few other odds and ends he'd noted throughout the week as running low. He checked the figure against his sense of the store's overall cash position, satisfied that the coming order, while a bit larger than usual given the approaching harvest festival, was well within what the week's takings could reasonably support. He also glanced through a farmer's almanac he kept on the desk, a small, well-worn booklet he consulted mostly out of habit rather than any strict reliance on its predictions, checking its forecast for the coming week, which suggested continued mild, cool weather with a decent chance of the season's first real frost by Sunday night. Information that would likely prompt a small rush on canning supplies and warmer goods over the weekend. A detail he made a mental note of for Saturdays. Preparations. Ruth was already in bed by the time he finished, reading a few pages of a novel by the light of the small bedside lamp, and Walter joined her, setting his own reading aside after only a page or two, finding himself pleasantly tired enough that sleep came easily. The sounds of Friday evening on Main Street below, a car passing, a distant burst of laughter from outside the diner, fading gradually into the quiet as he drifted off. Walter woke earlier than usual on Saturday, well before 5, aware even in the last moments of sleep that the day ahead would be the busiest of the week and require an earlier start than his usual routine allowed. He dressed quickly in the cool pre-dawn dark, went down to open the stockroom rather than the front door first, and spent the better part of an hour making sure every shelf, bin, and display was as fully stocked as the week's remaining inventory would allow, restocking the flour and sugar bins to their fullest, refilling the candy jars completely, and setting out extra stacks of paper bags near the register in anticipation of the day's heavier volume of transactions. He unlocked the front door a full half hour earlier than his weekday routine, at 6:30 rather than 7, since Saturday mornings reliably brought early customers eager to get their shopping done before the day's heat, mild as it was this time of year, or before the crowds built up further into the morning. Ed Tolliver was already out sweeping his own stretch of sidewalk when Walter stepped out to do the same, both men exchanging their usual brief greeting, though today's held a slightly different note, a shared, unspoken acknowledgement that Saturday demanded a bit more readiness than the days preceding it. Carl's delivery truck, which normally came only on Mondays, made a smaller supplementary stop on Saturday mornings as well, bringing whatever perishables or fast-moving stock Walter had specially requested midweek to help him through the weekend rush. And Walter spent a portion of the early morning unloading and shelving this smaller delivery alongside his usual opening tasks. By 8 o'clock, the store was busier than at any other point in the week, a steady stream of customers moving through the aisles, the bell above the door ringing again and again in a near-constant rhythm, the register's brass keys clicking under Walter's fingers far more frequently than on any weekday. He worked efficiently, but without any real sense of hurry, having long since developed the ability to move through even a busy morning at the same unhurried, methodical pace that governed his quieter days, simply compressing more of that same steady rhythm into each hour. He weighed flour and coffee for one customer, while another waited patiently to have a length of fabric measured and cut from the bolt, while a third browsed the newly arranged harvest display in the front window, commenting favorably on the pumpkins and the festival sign. Children darted between their parents' legs toward the candy jars. Farmers came through to settle their weekly trades, and a small queue formed periodically at the register, though it never grew so long that anyone seemed to mind the wait. Most of the customers using the time to chat with their neighbors also waiting in line, the queue itself becoming a small, pleasant social occasion rather than any real inconvenience. Mrs. Purnell came through again, as she often did on Saturdays in addition to her usual Monday visit, this time picking up a few extra items for a weekend visit from her daughter, and the two of them exchanged a warm, brief conversation amid the morning's bustle, Walter managing to weigh out her order and keep half an ear on their conversation simultaneously. A small skill developed over years of exactly this kind of multitasking. By 11, the morning's heaviest rush had begun to taper, though the store remained busier than any weekday afternoon, the steady flow of customers continuing at a slightly gentler but still substantial pace through the remainder of the morning and into the early afternoon. Around 2 in the afternoon, the pace finally slowed enough for Walter to catch a proper breath, the morning's rush having thinned the shelves noticeably in several sections, the flour bin lower than he'd seen it all week, the candy jars needing a full refill, the canning jar display down to its last dozen. He used the relative quiet of the early afternoon to restock what he could from the stockroom's remaining reserves, moving methodically through each depleted section, refilling bins and straightening displays that had gotten thoroughly rearranged by the morning's traffic. He took a later lunch than usual, closer to 2:30, his sandwich eaten in quick, practical bites rather than his usual slow, unhurried pace, aware that the afternoon, while quieter than the morning, would likely pick back up again as families finished their other Saturday errands and made their way to the general store for whatever remained on their lists. Sure enough, by 3, a second smaller wave of customers began moving through, not quite matching the morning's intensity, but steady enough to keep Walter occupied through the rest of the afternoon, the after-school crowd of children arriving for their weekly allowance of candy just as they did every day, though in slightly greater numbers on a Saturday, when a few extra pennies from a grandparent or an odd job around the house sometimes supplemented their usual budget. As Saturday evening approached, Walter began a slightly more involved closing routine than his usual weekday process, since Saturday marked the end of the store's business week and called for a full reconciliation of the week's figures rather than just the day's simple tally. He swept and straightened as always, but afterwards settled in at the counter with his ledger book for the better part of an hour, adding up each day's takings into a weekly total, reconciling the credit accounts he'd extended and collected against throughout the week, and comparing the whole figure against his running sense of the store's overall financial health. The week's total came in slightly ahead of the previous week's, a modest but welcome improvement that Walter attributed partly to the early harvest festival anticipation drawing a bit of extra spending, and partly simply to the ordinary variation that any small business saw from one week to the next without any particular explanation required. He recorded the final figures carefully, checked his arithmetic twice as he always did, and closed the ledger book with the quiet satisfaction of a week's honest work properly accounted for. He also spent a few minutes finalizing the order list for Monday's delivery, adding a final few items that the weekend's brisk business had revealed a need for. More of the popular gingham fabric, additional coffee, given how quickly it had moved, and a larger order of canning jars than he'd originally planned, the harvest season's demand showing no signs of slowing as the weeks went on. By the time Walter finally locked the front door for the night, a little after 7, the last of the Saturday crowd long since dispersed to their own suppers, the street outside had taken on its familiar Saturday evening quiet. A few cars still moving along Main Street toward the diner or the small movie theater, but the frantic energy of the day's shopping long since faded into the town's usual unhurried pace. He banked the week's cash in the small locked box, made a final note in his ledger about Monday's expected delivery, and turned off the lights section by section, the store settling into its familiar nighttime stillness, shelves neatly restocked, floor swept clean, the harvest display glowing faintly in the last of the evening light, through the front window. Upstairs, Ruth had a simple supper waiting, and the two of them ate together, tired in the pleasant, accomplished way that came at the end of a full week's honest work, talking quietly about the week just finished and the one ahead. The harvest festival drawing closer, the first frost expected any day now, the ordinary small rhythms of a small town continuing on, as they always did, one unremarkable, satisfying week folding quietly into the next. Outside, the last light faded from the sky over Millbrook Falls, porch lights glowing softly along the residential streets. The general store dark and quiet below, its shelves full, its ledger balanced, its door locked until Monday morning, when Walter would rise before his alarm once again, sweep the porch, unlock the door, and begin another ordinary week in exactly the same unhurried way he always had.